This is a 2008 Maybach 57S. It has a mammoth 6-liter V12 engine and over 500 horsepower. It's the epitome of luxury, but surprisingly can still get from 0 to 60 quicker than a Porsche Boxster. Maybach was founded in Germany over 100 years ago and is today a sub-brand of Mercedes-Benz. Well, actually saying it's a sub-brand just doesn't seem right. Most actually refer to it as the ultra-luxury arm of Mercedes, and I definitely have to agree. The drive today is courtesy of our friends Stefan and Trisha Brown of Exclusive Auto Wholesale, located on 2 Notch Road, directly across from the entrance to Sesquicentennial State Park. Hey guys, I'm Jordan Stallings with our show, Brokers in Cars Talking Contracts. Each week, we ride around in some really cool cars with some somewhat cool real estate brokers talking about the contract. Today, our guest is Trisha Brown, owner and broker in charge of Exclusive Realty, LLC. Trisha is a rising star in the Columbia real estate scene, and as I mentioned before, her husband owns Exclusive Auto, so you can get your new house and a new car from one family.
All right, well, hey, good morning, Trisha. How's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. What you got going on? What's on your mind?
Well, recently we've been having some issues with some of our lenders not necessarily approving the loan completely. So I know paragraph 6 of the contract, of course, says that the contract is contingent on financing, and there's the 5-day rule, but can you kind of explain how that goes exactly?
Yeah, so the 5-day contingency, and I'm glad you've asked because we get a lot of questions about this, and unfortunately we get a lot of the questions about this 4 days prior to closing. Right. The 5-day rule is there so that way you don't get too far along in the process, and it allows that contingency to be there up until 5 days prior to closing. But there's something really important to keep in mind. It's how you count that 5 days. Okay. So what a lot of people get wrong is you don't count the day of closing. So what you do is you go back 1 day prior to the date of closing, and then you count backwards 5 days, but you skip weekends and holidays. So what that means and the effect of that is, if you're before that time and the loan falls through, it allows the buyer to get out of the contract and of course get their earnest money back.
Okay, but then what happens if the buyer is not necessarily told 5 days, they're only told 2 days before closing?
Unfortunately, they're going to be in default of the contract. Yeah, so if 2 days beforehand their lender says, sorry, we can't get you approved for the mortgage loan, if time's running out, you're running short, unless the seller agrees to extend the contract, the buyer is going to be in default, unfortunately.
Wow.
Which means, of course, they're probably not going to get their earnest money back, which
right.
I know is pretty important.
Yeah. Then, okay, so I also had an issue a couple months ago too that I was kind of baffled on. What about how important is it with the financing type in the contract? Because if the buyer was originally conventional and wanted to switch. You're
talking about in paragraph 6 with the check boxes and the, so the reason why that's important, let me just ask you this question.
Okay.
If you personally, or maybe one of your sellers, if you're listing a property, if you get an identical contract and one of them says VA or FHA on the checkbox and one of them says either cash or conventional, which one do you think your seller's probably going to lean
towards? Cash, you know, if it was me, but
or even maybe the
conventional because less stipulation.
That's correct. So that's really why it's kind of important from the seller's perspective. And more importantly, it actually could lead to a default in the contract. And the reason why I say that is because if a buyer checks the box that says conventional and either it changes or they actually are doing a VA or FHA, and next thing you know, a VA appraiser comes to the house and the seller's like, well, wait, what's going on? I thought this was conventional. That could be a problem in the contract, which the seller can then void the contract.
So the seller basically has to approve that change as well.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, and actually, as we're talking about financing, I have another question too, because recently I wrote a contract, had a pre-approval, and then the listing agent called me and said, well, has your buyer already applied for financing? To me, that already meant, pre-approval meant that they had already applied for financing. But so what does the contract require of the buyer in applying for financing?
Well, I don't want to get this confused with the other 5-day rule we just talked about, but there's another kind of 5-day rule in paragraph 6. You're exactly right. That says within 5 days of that contract, the buyer does have to apply for financing. And the real reason for that is just quite simply, it takes a while to get a loan approved and closed. Right. So if the buyer is dragging their feet and doesn't actually do what they're supposed to do, The seller and listing agent probably want to know that, and that's why we put that stipulation in that contract for the 5 days.
Okay. So then what happens if the loan is rejected during the financing contingency?
So during the financing contingency, if the loan is rejected, the buyer actually would be able to get out of the contract and get their money back, but again, assuming we're in the right timing and it's prior to the 5-day rule.
Okay. And then with another kind of financing, then how should an agent handle seller financing? Should that be like...
Yeah, so that's one of the boxes in paragraph 6. You can check seller financing. It's pretty rare, but we do see it quite often enough where it's worth mentioning. If you go to paragraph 18, that would be the best place, in my opinion, to put those terms. So we're talking what's the loan payment amount, the payment due dates, interest rate, things like that. So you're going to have your normal terms of the seller financing, so the note and mortgage that will eventually be signed at closing. But we recommend that either be written into paragraph 18 right there in the contract, or either added an addendum separate that talks about those financing terms between the seller and buyer.
So with seller financing, should there also be a lease purchase agreement that goes with that?
No, not necessarily. If the whole idea is at closing a deed's going to be given to the buyer from the seller, it's just like a normal mortgage where the buyer's now then signing over a note mortgage back to the seller. So the seller effectively has almost no ownership in the property. Right. Their only interest is going to be that mortgage interest and that loan interest in the property. So they become the lender at that point.
Okay, that's interesting because I thought you had to do that. So,
Well, there's different seller financing options. So there's quite a few of those. There's lease to purchase options. There's also what we call an installment contract, and then you have just your straight seller financing where the seller does become the lender. So I would always encourage if a buyer and seller wanted to look through those options, they get in touch with us or an attorney to walk them through what that means to them and what the risks are for them.
And kind of actually along those lines, since the seller's financing, if there was a situation where the buyer is a cash buyer, then like what provisions are set forth to kind of protect the seller in the cash transactions?
Well, to protect the seller in a cash transaction, the seller wants to know where's the money coming from, right? Do they really have the money? Right. I think that's the most important thing. It would be to me. So what's required in the contract is several things that right up front, that if part of the contract, the buyer is required to give the seller some sort of evidence that they do have the money and they have enough money. So if it's a $100,000 contract, if they only show a statement that says they have $70,000 in their bank account, we got a problem. Right. But also along the way, it requires certain other things, such as what you can have, maybe have the closing attorney or have one of the parties do is request some sort of written verification that shows that there is money in an account and it's there and ready to be used between now and the date of closing. So if you're talking a couple weeks, a month, 45 days, whatever it is, that money is going to be there from here all the way to the end. So you can check back in the meantime, maybe once a week.
Make sure that nothing's changed.
That's exactly right. Okay. That's what I would encourage you to do, because you don't want them to go spend the money or something happen. And next thing you know,
they can't close.
A couple of days before closing, you realize, they don't really have the money.
Yeah. Look, which one other situation that I recently have, I have a house that I listed and it did not appraise. It came in as what they call a tidewater under appraisal. So what happens when the property does not appraise under this contingency, paragraph 6E?
Yeah, so 6E, it depends on what you check. So if you do check there that there is an appraisal contingency, then of course what that means is if the house does not appraise for the sales price or higher, then that's going to allow the parties to do a couple things. They can either renegotiate during the 3-day period, so the paragraph 6 explains that, or the seller, buyer could decide, I no longer want to buy the house. It was important to me that the house be worth at least this much according to the appraiser, but now that I know it's not, I'm just going to completely back out and get my earnest money back.
Okay, so they're not forfeiting their money in any way by backing out?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, of course, that is important that it appraise, because you just want to make sure the value's always there. My most recent seller was not happy with that. Unfortunately, he actually wanted to have it reappraised.
Okay.
At his cost.
Yeah.
So, but that didn't happen because the bank didn't allow it.
Yeah, and another thing you mentioned earlier, the difference between a cash and loan transaction, one thing to mention there too is when there's a lender involved, the appraisal is going to be done by the lender's appraiser.
Right.
The difference in cash, however, is that the parties can agree to what appraisal they use. Okay. So they can maybe use, maybe you have a real estate agent that does a market analysis. So it doesn't have to technically be a lender appraisal because there's not a lender involved. So that section of the contract does allow the parties to agree to something a little different than you otherwise would if there was a loan involved. So something to keep in mind there too.
Okay, that's interesting take to kind of use in the future when we have these situations.
That doesn't mean the parties are always going to be happy with and agree to it when it's all said and done, but if they agree to it up front and it's written there in the contract, then you should be fine, hopefully.
I think it's important that we understand each aspect of it so that we can not only understand it ourselves, but to be able to relay it back to our clients when we have these situations. Just because we constantly have different situations, the longer we're in this business, the more things come up.
The more things that come up that you scratch your head and go, I didn't even think this is something that could have happened, even if the contract addresses it or not. It's quite amazing. But well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Jordan, for the information.
Yeah,
it's very informative.
Both learned a lot.